is a very important session. It's on financing, which I think was also mentioned in some of the previous sessions, and very clearly we need to discuss the nitty-gritty of how to raise the finances, because we are talking about so many solutions like nature-based solutions, ecosystems-based adaptation. We're talking about how to invest in nature, but how to raise the finances for all these different kinds of solutions, whether it is for climate change or for other problems that we are facing today. After all, we live in an age of as we say, polycrisis or multiple crises. So we also need to think about finances through the systemic manner, where we can link these issues together and look at human well-being and also the well-being of ecosystems itself. So we have with us a very esteemed panel, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm not going to introduce them in really, because their bios are pretty long and you must have seen that already, but we have with us three panelists. We have with us Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi in India. We have with us Dr. Kamal Baba, who is a Distinguished Professor of Biology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Founder-President of the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment. And we have with us Purvi Patel, International Affairs Fellow in India on Council on Foreign Relations and a Visiting Fellow at the Gateway House. So thank you so much once again. So let me, maybe get started with the question of, I think, we look at institutional solutions first of all. I think that comes up a lot. We need to come up with solutions. Of course, we talk about bottom up, but we keep going back to this notions of how do institutions wake up to this reality and how do they incorporate climate and other environmental concerns. So if all the panelists could start by just briefly talking about how governments, international organizations, and dare I say regional organizations as well, because I think that's a major that's a major lacuna when it comes to the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, or how we look at regional organizations' role. How do they really collaborate to secure sufficient financing for conservation and sustainable development projects in the Eastern Himalayas? So maybe sir, you can start.
First of all, good afternoon, and I want to thank Manipara Foundation for organizing this really very lively discussion. And I think one thing I found throughout the morning is that there is a continuity to our dialogue. So I think this is a very, very important, has been a very important session, which probably will continue through this afternoon and tomorrow. Because for the first time, as far as I can remember, and I've been attending these Manipara Foundation meetings for the last 7 or 8 years, that we have come together with a great vision. And not only that, our discussions are very coherent and they are continuing. And that's really a great thing. So I just want to continue the discussion. I think your question is very important, but I'm not perhaps very competent to address that. I will talk in relation to that, Professor. Perhaps other panelists will specifically address that question. I want to continue with where Ranjit left. He talked about asset classes, and he talked about the value of all these forests and the ecosystems. And Ranjit, I want everybody to be reminded of Partha Dasgupta's comments last year, and he was in Bangalore just 2 weeks ago, and I want to make those points. That very often we value what we see, what is visible. There are a lot of things in biodiversity which are not visible, and we don't value those things. And those invisible things are processes that maintain ecosystems, processes that regulate ecosystems, processes that give us the visible manifestation of biodiversity we see. And we have not yet even begun to determine how we assign value to these processes, let alone address your question, what are the institutions? The second thing I want to comment is, of course, all this valuation is very necessary. The funding is very necessary. But we don't have to wait till we take action. We have a lot of assets at our disposal. India is one of the countries, or one of very few countries where we have abundance of youth, which is present here. That is our greatest asset at the moment. And I'm really so happy to see the Fellows program flourishing. At A-Tree we are doing a number of things. Terry is known to do a number of things. So I want to add one more value, or one more fact, or the figure I should say. 1 billion amount we want to raise in terms of dollar, great forest, and I think figure was mentioned. And let us also say, we want to, during the next 10 years, train 100,000 eco-volunteers. We don't have to train those necessarily. There are people working in the field, addressing these issues in rural areas, in many, many places. So that is our greatest value, the greatest asset we can use right away to realize the other values from nature and to restore nature. So I'll just pause here.
Thank you, Dr. Baba. Those really actually extremely valuable points, and particularly to introduce the notion of youth as another resource that can be, a kind of non-financial resource for our efforts. Let me also begin by thanking Balibara Foundation for inviting me at the 11th Eastern Himalayan Visionomics Forum. And I must say, one of the driving sort of visions, driving thoughts that I have always associated with Ranjit has been this notion of naturenomics. So I'm not quite sure if I'm going to address your question directly in terms of the institutional mechanism, how governments and the international community can actually directly contribute to financing for for what we want. But let me just give one idea, which is, and illustrate it in one respect, is how can we mainstream the idea of naturenomics into conventional economics. And let's just give you an illustration. When we value a piece of land, let's say we take an acre of land which has 100 trees, or another acre of land which has no trees at all. Do we include the value of just trees? I'm not talking about the rest of the biodiversity that may be there in that land. Do we have a system of incorporating the value of 100 trees that are traded in the market? No. In fact, the trees have zero value. If a plot of land has 100 trees and it's acquired by me, one of the first things that I might do is to demolish, to cut down the trees. So in fact, and then that is sold, I would say pretty much as kabadi, because it's not really valuable. It's valued just as wood. So I think the first thing that we should try to do is to mainstream this idea of naturenomics and introduce it in our, in our trade in land, in buying and selling land. I mean, if we did this, then I think a lot of other things would follow, because you have just introduced the notion of valuation of land in every transaction. That's fundamental to practically everything. And if you just see this climbing going up to the national level, to the international level, you have the built-in valuation of nature into the economy. And so that's why nature economics is very, very important. And I think it's important, it's not been valued. And I'd like to offer to Rajiv that the center that I'm associated with, the Center for Policy Research, is willing to join hands with you and perhaps work on this whole idea of naturenomics, of valuation of nature, not just as asset classes, but even the larger sense of the invisible value that you talked about, and so on. Thank you.
So I will build a bit on those comments really quickly. I'm not a finance expert, and you will see that from my bio right away. So we could sit here and talk about things like green bonds and climate markets and all of that sort of thing. I think that's where a lot of the financing conversation has been. But I also think a lot of this conversation has been dividing things into specific categories, which is very capitalist in a way, very colonial in a way as well, right? To talk about this is how you finance certain things we want to actively do, and this is the valuation of not doing anything to nature. And a friend of mine back there, one of my new friends, pointed out, why would we use sort of these capitalist models to talk about preserving nature when capitalism has been destroying it? And my sort of pushback on that was this, ingrained in that mentality is this idea that if we leave nature alone, nature is not actively doing anything, it's just sitting there. And that, I think, is a base problem in how we think, because a tree sitting there is not doing nothing, right? It is preventing soil degradation, it's preventing erosion, it's collecting water, it's putting carbon back into the ground. It is actively doing something in a way that we are not valuing. And so one of the things that I've seen in the climate conversations is you have one set of people talking about, restoring nature, and you have another set of people talking about climate mitigation. In order to prevent billions, millions of dollars of losses due to climate change, what are we going to invest in climate mitigation factors? And there is a lot of money being poured into that. We are not bridging that gap. We are not talking about keeping restored lands as a climate mitigation factor. We're not talking about necessarily, preserving or restoring mangrove forests is a climate mitigation tactic for preventing coastline degradation. But we don't necessarily talk about it that way. There is money for climate mitigation. There may not be as much money as we want for conservation, but a lot of it depends on how we are talking about these things and how we are talking about what the value of different assets are actively doing and not. If we humans are not actively doing something somewhere, is there still activity happening? And I think that question has not been asked, but if we ask that question, we might be able to revalue a bit where the money goes and how we sort of see it.
Yeah, thank you so much for these introductory remarks. I think that, that really gives us a lot of scope for discussing many things, like to ask the right kind of questions about, how to value ecosystems. And probably, Dr. Baba, if you could reflect on that, what are the effective methods of valuing and quantifying the economic benefits, but also beyond that, because I think, even when we are talking about non-economic benefits, I think everything has an economic value, but we need to know how to quantify that. So what are the methods, and if you could maybe, reflect a little bit on how to influence the policy decisions, because for instance, we've been having discussions like in the Uttarakhand example, where the government said, we are investing so much in nature, more than 70% of the land is covered with forests, and they're talking about payment of ecosystem services, through which, of course, the concept of gross environment product, based on air quality, forests, and many other issues have been discussed. So are there models such as these? They are in the process of quantifying it, but at the same time, there are a lot of gaps and challenges, of course. So if you could reflect a little bit.
Well, there are a number of methods, I think. Many people know how to value nature. And they have plus points and weak points. And I think it'll be better not to get into those methods. But economists are in general, moving away from looking at nature. I'm talking about an environmental economist, just putting some sort of a rupee or a dollar value. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of things, which are sort of priceless. And people are now talking about not carbon bonds, but people are talking about biodiversity bonds. That you have to convince the society, financial institutions, that there is an inherent value in conserving biodiversity. And I don't want to contradict what Ranjit said. There's a lot of value in that. Those approaches will be pursued. But I think the point is we have to move further and not really focus that much on methods, but the whole concept. And second point I want to make is, again, I want to emphasize, we really don't have to wait till we have completed our process of valuing nature, till we have raised $1 billion. We can do a lot. A lot of institutions are doing a lot. So I want to focus on how do we move forward with this concept. And as again Ranjit mentioned, I think we have to enlarge our coalition, enlarge our collaborative. Next year, we don't want to talk about 3 or 4 or 5 organizations that are partners, but maybe 15 or 20 organizations that are partners that have come together. Each of these organizations, A-Tree, TERI, including Balipara Foundation, they have their own programs in the Himalaya, and there are many other institutions that have programs. While we continue to do our individual things, we also have to come together to see how we realize this common shared vision. And what we have at our disposal, again I will repeat, we have hundreds of young people, thousands of young people, millions of young people, not only in academia, but in the local communities we work with. We have the resource in terms of the people, people out there, every day, ordinary people or farmers, they are thinking of biodiversity and they are doing things. And so we have to marshal those resources and combine with the young people we are engaged in, and technology. I think we are very good. We have made a lot of, I think where we are now today in India compared to where we were 20 years ago as an economic power has been made possible because the way we have used technology for our development and for alleviating poverty in a way one can say. And so there are a lot of things we can do with our existing resources, and I hope, I'm very, very hopeful that we're going to make a lot of progress during the next few years.
So Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, just carrying on from where Dr. Baba has left the conversation. So I think one of the commonly used terms in the context of the Himalayas, or the Hindu Kush Himalaya, I would say, it's a much broader region, is that this region is extremely ecologically fragile. The word fragility is used so often in this context. So there is, there is also that the political, economic, social, so many connotations attached to this term fragility in this context, which is often forgotten about. That development, the trade-offs happening between development and conservation, and also the way we are thinking about, say, Dr. Baba mentioned about building synergies. In a way he talked about this. So, could you maybe talk about Eastern Himalayas particularly, and then maybe talk about the social, economic implications of what does it mean to have ecologically resilient, or resilience itself is a very very loaded term. We have to use it carefully, but also in terms of how do we carry on this process of development and conservation, looking at the synergies and not really going into the language of trade-offs itself, which may actually increase the so-called fragility that we are talking about.
So, thank you. I think that's a very big question. I'm not sure I'm competent to answer it. And you asked very specifically on the Eastern Himalayas. But since you started with the Hindu Kush, let me start off from a slightly sort of higher level. It's not just the Hindu Kush, it's also the Pamirs. And if we include the Pamirs, the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas, one of the startling things that we would realize is that virtually every single river system in at least most of Asia emanates from this water tower. That is this entire area. And the slightest degree of warming, I think Michael Dawson in the morning gave us some statistics on 1.1, 1.3, 1.4, very close to 1.5, the tipping level. Every slight degree of fluctuation in the weather there would mean, glacial melts, melting water, and ultimately, possibly, I'm saying in a very finite level, the end of civilization as we know it. And this connects us literally from that level of the Pamirs right down to the average farmer who's losing their land, or the forests that are making agricultural practices unsustainable because amongst other things, we're not capturing, storing enough water, and the water is not being able to provide the sustenance for agriculture. So, and the big challenge that I'm finding here actually is something that was spoken about in the morning, is we talk about tribals and indigenous people knowing the connection between nature and and livelihood. But in fact, I think a lot of people, and that includes many indigenous communities, find it difficult to make the connection between what is happening on the ground and climate change. So there is a vast area of awareness raising that needs to be done. And this needs to be translated in ways that people can understand as affecting their lives. And the second thing that I would say is that, there is a lot of stuff. I think, Dr. Baba once again mentioned a number of, the kind of synergies that we can create. So there's a lot of synergy at the people's level. People realize what is happening. But if you look at our policies at the national and even international level, actually big business, corporations, governments, even international organizations, all the things that they are doing are totally contrary to the wisdom that has existed and has continued to emanate from the ground. So you may have individual initiatives, and I think individual initiatives can do a lot. Events like this translate individual initiatives into community awareness and maybe community actions, and a lot of others, institutions or NGOs, civil society organizations contribute to that. But the translation from that level to government policy or policies of big business, that doesn't happen. And that's going, and it's overwhelmingly much stronger than the initiatives that are coming from the ground. And how do we link the two? How do we balance the initiatives that are needed and are being felt from the ground with the kind of policies which are big capital policies, which are highly disruptive, In fact, they depend on destruction and disruption rather than conservation. How do we address that? How do we address this kind of mindset change that is required at the policy level of the government? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I just wanted to flag it for our audience.
Yeah. So, what you spoke about, the big disruption that is happening at the the top-down level, and the kind of understanding there's at the bottom-up level, especially at the level of the indigenous communities, rural communities, the ones practicing agriculture, because essentially all the countries in this region are dependent on agricultural sector, which is highly vulnerable to environmental climate change and everything. Purvi,
Can I just add one
yeah,
thing?
sure,
Sorry,
sure.
Please excuse me. Take the Forest Conservation Amendment.
Yeah.
You know, so at one level we make these great sort of pledges and promises at COP 27, 28, Biodiversity Convention, etc. and so on. But at another level we are actually whittling down the protections that actually exist for our forests. So this is a kind of example that I wanted to give for the contradiction between, you know, what is needed and what is actually happening. And we are not really addressing that. And that actually requires climate action at the people's level.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Purvi, if I could come to you, you know, and that really sets up a foundation for you to talk more about what does climate resilience or an ecological resilience or socio-ecological resilience mean for the communities that are most affected by the disruptions that he spoke about. And, you know, one of the things that I often hear about is the fact that, you know, of course, when we talk about finance, there is a question of the quantity, of course, that is lacking. There is also a problem of quality because, you know, much of the finance is also provided in the form of loans and, you know, which actually adds to the burden of the communities. And of course, access. I think access is the biggest issue as far as the local communities are concerned, and you know, the ones that are, you know, are of course the rich knowledge houses that are there, which is of course not represented well enough in the policy arena. But how does then, you know, access to finance, you know, one of the biggest challenges is how to even write a grant proposal. You know, I find that, you know, very, very strange that this is something I've come across in many of my conversations that, yeah, we want the money, we know what our problems are, but how do I write this very technical grant proposal to, you know, submit it to some UN agency to get the funding itself. So I was wondering, maybe you could talk about, with your experience also of working within some of these, you know, organizations, how do local communities really access the finance and access the capacity? Of course, capacity building is a big part of it. You know, in terms of many sectors within this region that are affected by various ecological crises.
Well, on the one hand, I mean, if you're talking about, for example, the large international NGOs and the UN system being able to provide finance directly, that is a large discussion, both within the UN system as well as USAID is going through this in terms of how do they internally change their processes so that grants can go directly to organizations on the ground, right, who know exactly what their needs are. Very often, the biggest problem are the internal reporting requirements from the grant makers, right? You have to have a certain amount of accounting standards, you have to do reporting for a certain period of time every 6 months, you have to track certain indicators. These are things that small community organizations simply don't have the infrastructure for. And so part of it is talking to a lot of those funders saying, what do you really need and how can we adjust these internal accountability mechanisms, it's what they call them, right, to be able to really work with communities on the ground. So that I know is happening internally at those agencies right now. To what degree it will pan out, we have to see in the next few years. But in terms of viewing that kind of financing as separate from every other bit of financing, I think is where there's a disconnect, because there's this idea of, oh, there's sort of public sector financing to help local communities, and then there's the private sector, which is completely separated from that. And part of the work that I've done with the UN is specifically in livelihoods and diversification of livelihoods in certain populations. And what I can tell you there is very often the biggest factors preventing development in certain communities, especially displaced communities, communities that had to relocate, are the same factors that inhibit small business development generally. It's how the tax system is set up, it's how capital access is set up, it's how much of what kind of documentation you need in order to get access to a bank account and to access loans. So the specifics are not actually that different from what much of the private sector encounters. And I think the dichotomy of having two separate areas is sometimes what harms us. And so I speak to this because in terms of climate mitigation, there is research that shows that, you know, talking about population displacement, I'm a displacement expert for mass population movement. Very often when we're talking about climate as a factor in causing mass population displacement as opposed to conflict or other factors, there's this idea of, oh, there's a bigger climate event, and so that will create a bigger population outflow. And that's not true. The research doesn't bear that out. What it shows is that a really, really big climate event can have a smaller level of population displacement than a small climate event and larger population displacement. What's the difference? The difference is, as you say, resilience. It is a loaded term. For my purposes, I will define it as the ability to withstand shocks, right? You can have a large hurricane hit an area with excellent infrastructure, diversity in livelihoods, diversity in the way that response can happen, maintaining education for children, maintaining food and water supplies, and that larger event will have a smaller impact. But a small event, a small flood, can displace far more people if that region does not have infrastructure development, any kind of resilience for everyday livelihoods, diversity of livelihoods so that people can switch jobs easily. That is really what we're talking about in terms of climate resiliency. And so an answer to that is economic development in regions that are climate vulnerable. But the catch is, how do we do that in development? Because development, when you're importing solutions from other regions that are, I've been working with some farmers in Gujarat. Bringing in climate mitigation efforts in Gujarat into this region would make no sense, right? They're completely different ecosystems, completely different tactics. So then why would you take certain suggestions from the Western Hemisphere and bring them here and say we should do this for development and not expect that that might have bad influence or bad effect on the ecological systems here? What has to happen is you have to develop locally based solutions that will talk to the climate mitigation here, climate resiliency here. And the best source of this, in my opinion, are the indigenous communities. These are communities that have been here for ages. They know how to withstand floods. They know how to adapt and stay. And so then, for me, the question is, what are the solutions? How can they be adapted and scaled for development in this region to improve resiliency towards climate impacts? But importing ideas from elsewhere may not necessarily work, and I think that's where large corporations that have asset sort of investments in this area tend to go. This worked in Europe, let's use it here, and that usually, will create more harm than good in some cases.
Thank you. So we've run out of time completely, but just very briefly, if you could sum up your thoughts and what Purvi mentioned about the locally led owned solutions, and so Dr. Baba, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, and Purvi, of course, if you could, maybe talk about how do we then do this? How do we make this process more inclusive, participatory? Of course, scaling this up further, we know a lot of solutions on the ground which have worked, like community forests in Nepal. We heard the example of Bhutan also earlier. Many other solutions. How do we ensure that these are represented and these stories go out and they need to be heard and could actually be the step forward? So how do we do that? If you could briefly talk about that. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a very good way of ending it, and let me comment on your question in the light of what my panelist said a couple of minutes ago. We can think of the problem from the bottom level up and the top level down. I think from the bottom level up, I think we really need a paradigm shift in terms of, I think, funding you have talked about, and there's a lesson there for academics too. How do we work with the communities to outline the problems and come up jointly with the problem definition for whatever funding might exist, either with traditional funding agencies or with the government programs. And that would require a radical shift in the academia, the way the academics work, and those of us who are working in the environmental sector. Second, from the national level, I think it's not only the Forest Amendment Act. We have to find ways that in every government program or every action in every ministry, whether it's the state level or at the national level, the considerations of climate change and biodiversity are deeply embedded in the plan.
I absolutely agree. So, again, I'll try to address this from my personal example a little. I spent 36 years in diplomacy, which is basically interstate relations and international relations. And for 36 years, I've largely dealt with abstraction, very removed from ground reality. Things would be distilled down, and we would discuss at that level. But post-retirement, essentially, I've been working with small communities in Manipur. And I would say, and this might sound a bit reductionist, but let me offer it anyway. I would say the key to sort of building about this kind of change is really ultimately putting the small farmer in the middle. Because firstly, about 70 to 80% of our population, this is one way or the other, dependent on land, rivers, forests, water, whatever it is. And along with that, I think sort of the great resources, which is the sun, air, water, these are the fundamentals, out of which livestock, agriculture, everything is. And agriculture itself lives in an environment, in an ecosystem, which includes forests, water, rivers, people, consumption, livestock, and so many other things. So I think if we can put as much of our attention on the productivity, how to increase the sustainable productivity of small farmers, then we really start with a kind of holistic solution that takes into account communities, forests, nature, climate change, water conservation, and perhaps everything, because everything needs to come together in this one endeavor that is farming. And you don't go for large scale. I mean, you don't go for farm laws and big large scale farming, corporate farming. And again, I'll say that there's something instructive to be learned from Western history. Essentially, in Western history, you have Europe or even the Far East, which are agricultural economies that have now industrialized. Whereas you have the New World, where the colonialists came, literally dispossessed the natives of their land and introduced this kind of land. You had abundance of land, very few people, and you had introduced this kind of capitalist agriculture, which oddly enough we are now trying to bring back to the populated areas of the world, which is Africa, Asia, and India, and other places. So I think that whole model has to be reviewed. I mean, we need to really begin from where we began, which is the small.
Could be final words from you.
So I am still very much steeped in the diplomatic circles, and so I wanted to give sort of a macro level summation, just to remind everyone that this region, one of the reasons I asked to work specifically on this region, I just transferred from Latin America, but specifically Northeast India, is because in a way that I think a lot of people outside the region don't understand, this area is a linchpin to a lot of economic and geopolitics in the larger region, which I think people in the region do understand, right? It's India's economic link to ASEAN. There are the border security issues with Myanmar and China. There are connectivity potential with Bhutan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. There's connectivity concerns and potential with the rest of India. So the economic development of this region is important to very many actors, and particularly including Western allies like the US, who want India to be strengthened in the face of Chinese sort of ambition in the region, right? And so there are so many actors interested in what's going on in this region, and the economic development is quite important, but how that development happens is going to be critical, because as I just mentioned, you can bring in economic development in a way that undermines stability in the region because it's going against climate mitigation, because it's worsening the impacts of climate. And if we're not aware of that, then climate change is going to happen, and poor infrastructure and poor development will undermine a lot of that stability. But if it happens well, then it will boost the economic stability of the region, it will improve livelihoods for people in the region, it will boost a lot of security in the region. And so the way that this development happens, and making sure that it happens with the buy-in of the local communities and the indigenous communities on the ground, is, for me, critical to maintaining the stability of the region. And we just need larger actors who don't understand the region very clearly, but have an interest in the region, to see that and to buy into that same sort of vision.
Thank you for also bringing the geopolitical angle to this whole issue. So we conclude the session with this. Thank you so much for the interesting and enlightening discussions that we've had, and thank you to Balipara Foundation for organizing this fantastic conference to discuss some of these issues. Thank you once again.